The Mafia boss was about to throw them out. Then a 5-year-old boy walked up to him and placed something in his hand. The room went silent. Because in that moment, he realized something he wasn't supposed to. My son. She had 3 bills due, an empty fridge, and a phone that kept buzzing with numbers she couldn't pay. So when the agency called at 6 in the evening offering a last-minute catering shift at double rate, she said yes before the woman finished speaking. She didn't ask for the address. She should have. By the time the taxi turned through the iron gates and the full size of the Soren estate came into view, floodlit, vast, and guarded by men who stood too still to be regular security, Flora knew she had made a mistake. The kind you couldn't undo by simply turning around. Beside her, holding her hand with both of his, was Tom. He was 5 years old. Small for his age. He wore his best shirt because Flora always dressed him carefully, not because they had money, but because she refused to let the world see him as someone who didn't matter. He carried a worn cloth satchel over one shoulder, the same satchel he took everywhere, the same one his mother had packed for him 2 years ago and asked Flora never to remove from his keeping. Tom looked at the estate through the taxi window without fear. That was the thing about him, he never seemed afraid of things that frightened everyone else. Flora paid the driver, took Tom's hand, and walked through the gates. She told herself they just needed to survive 4 hours. She had no idea Tom had been waiting much longer than that. The inside of the Soren estate was the kind of place that made a person feel immediately wrong, too loud in their movements, too visible, too ordinary. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high. Guests moved in expensive silence, their voices low, their laughter controlled. The men at the edges of the room weren't waiters. They were watchers. Flora clocked all of it in 30 seconds. She had learned early in life that the first thing you do in a dangerous room is understand it. And this room, behind all its beauty, behind the polished floors and the long tables dressed in white, was dangerous. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the rain arrives. She found the head caterer, collected her tray assignments, and did the only other thing she needed to do before her shift began. She found a quiet corner behind the service partition near the kitchen corridor and knelt in front of Tom. "Stay here," she said. "Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. You have your notebook." Tom looked at her calmly. "I know. I mean it. I know, Auntie Flora." She set him up on a folding chair with his notebook and a juice box and a piece of bread she'd wrapped in foil. He opened the satchel himself, placed the notebook on his knee, and looked through the gap in the partition door at the main hall. Not fidgeting. Not restless. Watching. Like someone who had come here for a reason, and was simply waiting for the right moment. Flora didn't notice. She had a tray to carry. Tom had grown up with a story. Not a bedtime story, a real one. His mother had told it to him in pieces, over years, in the quiet hours when it was just the two of them and the world felt small enough to hold. She told him about a man she had loved. She told him the man had not left by choice. She told him that one day, when the time was right, Tom would find him, and that he would know him when he did. She never showed him a photograph. She said she didn't have one left. But she described the way the man held himself. The stillness of him. The way a room shifted when he entered, like air pressure changing before a storm. So Tom sat behind the partition with his notebook open and watched the room through the gap in the door, not because he was bored, but because he was looking. He watched the guests arrive. He watched the staff move. He studied faces the way his mother had taught him to, not for what people showed, but for what they kept underneath. Then the energy in the room changed. It was subtle. A slight straightening of postures. A quiet that spread from one end of the hall to the other like a ripple moving outward from a stone dropped in still water. Tom looked toward the far entrance. A man had walked in. And something happened in Tom's chest, not recognition exactly, but something close to it. A feeling he had no name for yet, but had been waiting his whole short life to feel. He reached into his satchel and touched the ring through its cloth wrapping. And he waited. Aldrich Soren did not get where he was by being slow. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and dressed in a dark suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. He had spent 30 years as the Soren family's most trusted authority, the man who handled problems before they became visible, the man who kept the architecture of power intact when everything else threatened to shift. He was standing near the far wall with a glass of wine he hadn't touched when he first noticed the boy through the partition gap. He looked for no more than 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. He set his glass down on the nearest surface and kept his face entirely still, because men in his position knew that the face was a document, and documents left in the wrong hands became evidence. But his mind was moving fast. He had known about Isla Adara's child for 14 months. He had tracked the boy's existence from a distance and made a careful, considered calculation. The child was untraceable, contained, no threat to anything Aldrich had built. The mother was dead. The sister had moved cities. The matter was closed. The matter was now sitting behind a folding door 30 feet away, watching the room with eyes that Aldrich could not allow Adrian Hector to see. He walked to the floor manager with the smooth, unhurried authority of a man who had controlled rooms like this for 3 decades. The child behind the partition, he said quietly. Remove him. The woman too. Now. He didn't explain why. He never explained why. Flora was moving through the far end of the main hall with a tray of drinks when the memory found her. It always came without warning, Isla's face in those last months, thinner than it should have been, eyes still sharp even when everything else was fading. Isla had always been the stronger one. The smarter one. The one who walked into rooms, understood them immediately, and made decisions that only revealed themselves as brilliant later, when the pieces finally clicked into place. Flora had never fully understood the decision about the ring. Isla had placed it in Tom's satchel herself, on a Tuesday afternoon when the autumn light came sideways through the window and made everything look like the end of something. She had wrapped it carefully in cloth, set it inside the small front pocket, and zipped it closed. Then she had held Tom's face in both hands and spoken to him very seriously, the way she always did when she needed him to carry something important. There is a man, she said. You haven't met him. But you will know him when you see him. When you do, give him this. Tell him your mama said he would know what it means. Tom had nodded with the gravity of a child given a mission. Flora had watched from the doorway and hadn't understood. She asked Isla about it later, and Isla said only. When he finds the right person, he'll know. Don't interfere. Just let him. Standing now in the middle of the Soren estate, Flora felt that instruction shift, from something she had accepted without understanding, into something that felt, for the first time, like it had been engineered. Like Isla had known exactly where Tom would end up. The floor manager found Flora between the kitchen corridor and the east side of the main hall. He was a small, efficient man with an apologetic expression that didn't reach his eyes. He spoke quietly, the way people who work for powerful families learn to deliver bad news, without volume, without drama, and without any invitation to respond. You were briefed on the terms of tonight's arrangement, he said. No children on the property. You violated that. I need you to collect the boy and wait by the service exit. Flora kept her face still. She had learned this too, how to take a blow without showing where it landed. Of course, she said. She set her tray down and went to the partition. Tom was already watching her when she arrived. He had his notebook closed and his satchel on his shoulder, as if he had been expecting this moment. We have to go, Flora said. I know, Tom said. She took his hand and they began moving toward the service exit, through the edges of the main hall, keeping close to the wall, heads down, the way people leave rooms when they've been told they don't belong. Flora didn't look up. She didn't make eye contact with the guests who noticed them. She focused on the exit and on getting Tom through it and on the quiet rebuild she would begin tomorrow, another agency, another shift, another way through. Across the room, Aldrich Soren watched them move toward the door. His expression was smooth. Satisfied. The problem was resolving itself exactly as it should. He was almost at ease, until the energy at the far end of the hall shifted, and Aldrich's glass stopped halfway to his lips. Adrian Hector had changed direction. Adrian didn't make a scene of it. He never did. He simply redirected, the way a man who notices everything redirects when something in a room doesn't add up. One moment he was moving toward the senior family table. The next, he had adjusted course toward the service corridor, and the guests nearest to him adjusted accordingly, because that was what people did around Adrian Hector. They moved with him without being asked. He had clocked the disturbance from across the hall, a floor manager, a woman in staff uniform, a small boy. Nothing that required his attention on a night like tonight. Except for one thing. The child. He had seen the boy for only a moment, a brief, peripheral glimpse through a gap in the partition, and he had buried what he noticed before it had the chance to fully form. Because forming it, naming it, would mean something he could not afford on this night, in front of these people. He told himself it was nothing. A passing resemblance. Children often looked like people they had no connection to. He changed direction anyway. By the time he reached the edge of the main hall, Flora and Tom were already near the far exit, Tom's hand in Flora's, moving steadily, not looking back. Adrian stopped. Something in the boy's posture. The set of his shoulders. The way he held himself. Another flicker, quicker this time, harder to push down. He made himself look away. He looked at Aldrich instead, who was watching from across the room with an expression so carefully neutral it told Adrian everything. He looked back at the woman and the child. And he walked toward them. Flora heard the room change before she saw why. She had been staring at the exit, close now, maybe 30 feet, when the conversations around her dropped in volume and the particular quality of the silence shifted from background to foreground. She looked up. Adrian Hector was walking toward them. She had learned his name from the other staff in the first 20 minutes of her shift, the way you learn the names of things in a room that could hurt you. She knew who he was. She knew what he ran. She knew what it meant that he was crossing the hall in their direction, and her stomach turned to stone. He stopped in front of them. He looked at her first. His eyes were dark and still and gave nothing away. She was staff. She had broken a rule. She could see herself through his eyes, ordinary, replaceable, already forgotten. Then he looked at Tom. The look lasted no longer than 2 seconds. Something moved through his face, a tremor so small that only someone watching very carefully would have caught it, and then it was gone. Smoothed over. Controlled. In the space of those 2 seconds, Flora watched a man see something he had decided not to see. When he spoke, his voice carried across the hall without effort. They don't belong here. Get them out. The words hit the floor like stones. Flora nodded. She tightened her hand around Tom's. And then Tom did something she didn't expect. He didn't move. He stood completely still at her side, looking up at Adrian Hector with those calm, patient eyes of his, and then he looked up at Flora. And he let go of her hand. Flora's first instinct was to reach for him. Her hand went out, fingers open, ready to catch him back, and found nothing. Because Tom wasn't stumbling or running or doing anything that required catching. He was simply standing still, looking up at her with an expression she had seen before. It was Isla's expression. The one her sister wore when she had made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. Calm. Certain. Finished with deliberating. Tom, Flora said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment, not dismissively, not defiantly, but with a gentleness that was almost too large for a 5-year-old's face. Mama told me, he said simply. And then he opened his satchel. The room had not yet understood that anything unusual was happening. Adrian Hector had already half turned away, returning his attention to the evening, the dismissal complete in his mind. The floor manager had taken a step toward Flora to begin moving her out. Tom removed the cloth-wrapped ring from the front pocket of his satchel. He held it in both hands, the way he had practiced without knowing he was practicing. The way he had carried it for 2 years with a care that went far beyond his years. He looked across at the back of the man who had already turned away. And he walked forward. Not curious. Not lost. Completely, deliberately, purposefully, forward. Nobody stopped him. Afterward, every person in that room who was asked about it struggled to explain why. There were trained men stationed near every exit, men whose job was to notice things that didn't fit. The floor manager was 3 steps behind Tom. Aldrich Soren himself was watching from across the hall. And nobody moved. Maybe it was the silence he walked through. Maybe it was something in the way he moved, unhurried, unafraid, like someone who knew exactly where he was going and had already arrived in his own mind. Maybe the men closest to him simply couldn't find a reason to stop a child who looked, in that moment, more certain than anyone else in the room. Tom walked the full length of the Soren estate's main hall. Past the long white tables. Past the guests who turned to watch. Past the men whose hands drifted instinctively toward their sides, and stopped. Past the silence that spread around him like water pulling back before a wave. Adrian Hector heard it, the quality of the quiet, and turned. The boy was 4 feet away. Then 3. Then he stopped. He looked up at Adrian Hector with enormous, unhurried eyes and held out the ring, still wrapped in its cloth, with both hands. The way children offer things they've been trusted with. The way children mean it when they've been told something matters. Flora stood at the far end of the hall with one hand pressed to her mouth, watching her sister's son complete something that had been set in motion long before tonight. Aldrich had taken 2 steps forward. Then he stopped. Because it was already too late. Adrian looked down at the boy. At the ring in his small hands. He reached out, slowly, the way a man reaches for something he isn't certain is real, and took it. The cloth fell away as his fingers closed around it. Old gold. A simple band, worn smooth on one side from years of being turned and handled and carried close. He didn't need to look at the engraving to know it. He had held this ring before. He had given it away before. But he looked anyway. For characters on the inner face. His initials and hers, intertwined. A jeweler had made it at his instruction on a night 6 years ago when he pressed it into her hands and told her it wasn't a proposal, he wasn't ready for that word yet, but that it was a promise. That he would find a way through everything standing between them. That she should keep it until he did. He was told, 6 months later, that she had returned it through the lawyer. That returning it was her way of saying she understood. That it was over. He had believed it because the alternative, that she hadn't returned it, that she had kept it, that she had held on through everything that came after, was something he couldn't have survived knowing. His hand closed around the ring. The room was completely silent. Tom's voice came from below him, quiet, certain, carrying the weight of 2 years of faithful keeping. My mama said you'd know what it means. Adrian looked down at the boy. And for the first time in 6 years, the story he had been living, the version where she chose to leave, where she sent the ring back, where the chapter ended cleanly, broke open. Because she kept it. She kept it, gave it to her son, and sent him here. She never left. Adrian didn't speak. The ring was in his fist. His face was still, the stillness he had spent years perfecting, the kind that kept rooms from seeing what was happening behind his eyes. But this time the stillness was not control. It was the expression of a man standing at the edge of something enormous, trying not to fall in before he understood its depth. He thought about the boy's face when he first saw him through the partition gap. He had noticed. He had seen it, clearly, completely, and he had looked away. He had given the order without letting the noticing become a thought with edges, because letting it become a thought would have meant following it, and following it would have changed everything on the most important night of the Soren family's year. He had chosen blindness. He had chosen it deliberately, in the space of 2 seconds, and told himself it was the right decision. Now the ring was in his hand and a 5-year-old boy was looking up at him without fear, with the particular patience of someone who had been told the truth about where he came from and believed it completely, and Adrian understood that blindness had an expiry date. His had run out tonight. He raised his eyes slowly from the ring. Across the room, Aldrich Soren was watching him. Not with confusion. Not with the expression of a man surprised by what he was seeing. With the expression of a man watching something he had spent 6 years preventing, finally, irreversibly, arrive. "Did you know?" Adrian said. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. The question landed in the silence like a door closing. Aldrich had survived 30 years in the Soren family by being the man who did not panic. He had made hard decisions in difficult rooms and lived with them afterward without apology, because the alternative, second-guessing and revisiting, was the beginning of collapse. You made your calculation, you executed it, and you moved forward. That was the discipline. That was what separated the men who lasted from the men who didn't. He had made his calculation 6 years ago. He had executed it with precision. The girl was removed. The connection was severed. The ring was reported returned. The threat contained. He had made a second calculation 14 months ago when he learned about the child. He determined that a 5-year-old boy in a different city with a grieving aunt was not a structural danger. He decided to monitor quietly and act only if necessary. He had underestimated the aunt. He had underestimated the ring. He had catastrophically underestimated Isla Adara. Selim, he began. He used the name from Adrian's boyhood, the name only family used, because names carried weight in moments like this, and weight sometimes bought time. Adrian raised one hand. Aldrich stopped. The room was watching. Every senior family member, every allied guest, every person present at the most important Soren gathering in a decade, all of them watching the most powerful man in the room raise one hand at his uncle. And in that gesture, simple and absolute, the 30 years of authority Aldrich had constructed began to come undone. Adrian walked to Flora. The guests moved without being asked, not dramatically, simply the way people make way for gravity. Flora stood at the far edge of the hall where she had been rooted since Tom let go of her hand. One hand pressed to her mouth. Eyes wide and wet and trying hard to hold everything in. Adrian stopped in front of her. Up close, she saw what she hadn't expected. Not the cold authority he had worn when he gave the order to remove them. Not the stillness of a man in control. Grief. The kind that has been kept under pressure for a long time and no longer looks like sadness, it looks like stone. But she knew what lived underneath it, because she had watched Isla carry the same weight for years. How long did she have him, he asked. His voice was quiet. Careful. Like a man walking across uncertain ground. For years, Flora said. She died when he was 2. She told him the rest in pieces, Isla's illness, the isolation, the move to a different city after the lawyer came. The years of raising Tom alone. The ring in the satchel with instructions Flora had carried without fully understanding. And then she told him the part that cost her the most. She didn't think you sent the lawyer, Flora said. Not at the end. She figured out who really made the call, and why. She waited for a long time, hoping you'd find your way through. She paused. When she understood you didn't know, she stopped waiting. And she started planning. Adrian was silent for a long time. He looked at the ring in his hand. Then he turned and looked at Tom. Patient. Finished with the waiting. Adrian crossed back to Tom. He didn't announce it. He didn't prepare the room for what he was about to do. He simply walked back to his son, the son he hadn't known existed until 20 minutes ago, and crouched down in front of him until they were level. The room watched. Tom watched back. Up close, without the distance he had used to manage the noticing earlier, Adrian could see all of it. The shape of the boy's face. The way he held himself. The particular expression in his eyes that Adrian had seen every morning in every mirror for 37 years. He had no words for the size of what he was feeling. He didn't reach for any. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Tom considered this with the seriousness the question apparently deserved. "Yes," he said. Adrian stood. He held out his hand. Tom looked at it for one moment, then placed his small hand inside it, with the quiet confidence of a child who had been told exactly who this man was and had believed every word. Adrian walked him to the main table. He didn't make a speech. He didn't explain himself to the room or ask for the family's understanding. He simply walked his son to the head of the table and seated him there. The same chair where the family's most senior position had always sat. The guests who had demanded this child be removed an hour ago could not now meet his eyes. The floor manager had long since disappeared. Power had shifted, not loudly, not with declaration, but with the absolute finality of a door that had been closed and would never be opened again. Later, when the gathering had thinned and Tom had fallen asleep in a wide chair near the window with his satchel tucked under his arm, Adrian sat alone with the ring. He turned it in his fingers the way he had been turning it all evening, reading it, rereading it, feeling the weight of what it meant that she had kept it. He had already processed the grief of that. The anger that followed, not at Isla, but at the years, at the architecture of the lie, at himself for believing it, he would process in time. But now he was looking at the ring differently. Not as a sentimental object. Not simply as proof. As something else. He held it in proper light and studied the engraving with the focused attention of a man who had stopped being emotional and started thinking. The characters, his initials, Isla's, intertwined, were positioned with a precision that didn't match a jeweler's sentimental brief. He had described the design loosely. What was cut into the metal was something more structured. The spacing. The angles. The way the characters related to each other like components of a system rather than a decoration. Isla had been an architect. She thought in structures and systems. She approached every problem as something with a solution already embedded inside it, waiting to be found by the right person with the right knowledge. He thought about her hands. Her mind. She hadn't just sent him a promise. She had sent him something she needed him to find. The ring was a key. And only he had what was needed to turn it. Adrian worked through the night. The cipher required 3 things. He knew this without being told, because Isla was precise, and precision meant the lock was exactly as complex as the contents demanded. It needed both their names. It needed the date of the night he gave her the ring. And it needed a phrase she had said to him once, quietly, in a moment that had nothing to do with any of this, that he had never repeated to anyone and had never forgotten, because it was the kind of thing you say once and mean forever. When the cipher opened, it led him to a location. The location led him to a record. Assembled over 2 decades by Isla's father, a quiet, careful man who had spent his working life close to powerful families and had understood very early that the only safety available to him was documentation. Names. Dates. Transactions. Arrangements never meant to be written down anyway in a hand that never shook. Adrian read through it in the silence of the early hours. At the center of it, detailed, cross-referenced, annotated with the patience of someone building toward a specific truth for years, was Aldrich. Not Aldrich as the man who removed Isla on the patriarch's instruction. Aldrich as the architect of arrangements that the Soren family itself had never been supposed to know about. Private arrangements. Self-serving ones. Built quietly over 30 years inside the structure of a family whose trust he used as cover. Adrian set the record down. He thought about Tom. A 5-year-old boy carrying something across a room without knowing what it contained, trusted not because he understood it, but because he would deliver it. Isla had hidden the truth inside a promise and placed it in the one person no one would think to search. Her son. The full shape of it emerged slowly, and it was worse than Adrian had expected. Aldrich had not removed Isla solely because the patriarch told him to. Not entirely. The patriarch's unease about Isla's background had been real, but it had been manageable. Other men had married outside their world before. Other families had absorbed complications. What made Isla specifically dangerous had nothing to do with Adrian's feelings for her and everything to do with her father. Her father had been documenting Aldrich for years. Quietly, thoroughly, without Aldrich's knowledge, the way careful men document things they understand they will one day need as protection. He had seen enough. He had written enough. And if Isla remained close to Adrian, if time passed and trust deepened and she eventually learned the full shape of the world she was entering, the probability of the record surfacing became something Aldrich could not accept. So he had used the patriarch's concern as cover. He framed Isla as an outside threat to a family that was constitutionally protective of itself, and the patriarch acted on that framing without ever knowing the real reason underneath it. And then Aldrich had done one more thing. He constructed the story of the ring being returned, not because Isla returned it, but because a kept ring was a thread that could be pulled. He told Adrian she sent it back cleanly, and he made sure Adrian's grief became the kind that locked down, that stopped asking questions. The grief was the lock. And for 6 years it had held. Until a 5-year-old boy walked across a room and placed the key in the right hands. Adrian called the senior family together before sunrise. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anger. He simply opened the record on the table between them and walked through it, names, dates, arrangements, with the calm of a man who had already decided what happened next and was simply informing the room. Aldrich sat across from him. He did not reach for excuses. He had lived too long in rooms like this to waste time on excuses. He sat straight in his chair and took each piece of evidence as it was placed before him and did not flinch. That was his version of dignity. It did not save him. Adrian worked through it the same way Aldrich had worked through everything for 30 years, quietly, structurally, without theater. Each arrangement unwound. Each alliance Aldrich had built within the family identified and severed. Each protection he had accumulated, the relationships, the debts, the goodwill carefully constructed over 3 decades, removed, one by one, in front of the people whose trust he had spent those decades harvesting. The men in the room had known Aldrich their entire adult lives. Not one of them spoke in his defense. When Adrian was finished, he did not call for anything dramatic. He simply gathered the record, looked at his uncle across the table, and said, "You are done here." Quiet. Absolute. The same way all Soren verdicts were delivered. The same way Aldrich had delivered his own, on a day 6 years ago when he arranged for a young woman to be removed from the life she had been building with the man now sitting across from him. What goes around, in rooms like this, always comes around. The estate was quiet by the time the last car left. The chandeliers still burned over empty tables and chairs pushed back from where the family had sat through the long proceedings of the night. The white tablecloths, perfect at the start of the evening, now held the evidence of hours, a ring of wine here, a displaced candle there, the small disorder of a night that had become something no one had planned for. Flora sat near the window, shoes off, hands folded in her lap. She didn't know what her life looked like from here. She didn't know what was being asked of her, or what any of this meant for tomorrow or the week after. She was tired in the way you are tired after something large has passed through you, not unpleasantly, but completely. Tom was asleep in the wide chair beside her, satchel on the floor at his feet, one hand resting open on his knee. His face was completely at peace. The task he had carried for 2 years was finished. He didn't know the full shape of what he had delivered. He only knew what his mother had asked of him, and that he had done it. Adrian came into the room quietly. He took the chair across from them and sat without speaking. They stayed like that for a while, the 3 of them in the lamplight, connected by a woman who was not there, and a boy who was. Eventually Adrian looked at Tom's sleeping face. Then at Flora. She knew exactly what she was doing, he said. Flora nodded. She always did. The ring was in Adrian's keeping now. The record had surfaced. The man who had buried the truth had been buried by it. And Isla Adara, who had never been allowed to fight back the way she deserved, had found a way to do it anyway. Through the one thing no one thought to stop. Her son.